Welcome to this session of the Raising Peace event that is held in the lead up to the United Nations Day of Peace on the 21st of September. My name is Vishuringa and I'm part of the Raising Peace network. I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where each of us is today. I acknowledge their elders and their care for the land. The Raising Peace network is an alliance of more than 30 organizations that together are working to share ideas, knowledge and inspiration for a peaceful world. To learn more about the network, go to our website raisingpeace.org.au. This session is recorded and will be placed on our website in the next weeks. Our Zoom tech host is Charlie, and he's called Raising Peace. And hopefully we won't have any Zoom problems tonight. Please mute yourself. You can place questions and comments for the speakers in the chat. Please do not engage in debate in the chat. This session is called People's Forum on How to Avoid All Wars. An ambitious session, and I'm certainly looking forward to it. The facilitator is Margaret Reynolds, who will introduce the four speakers and facilitate the session, and Charlie will put the bios of the speakers in the chat. Margaret is a former senator in the federal parliament for 16 years, a tireless peace campaigner and currently national president of WILF, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. Margaret, over to you.
Thank you very much and welcome everyone. This is an extremely important discussion we're having this evening, and I really welcome you all to it because it's going to be your voices that are influential in trying to change some of the mindsets that exist within government and within the Defence Department today. As indicated, the bios are in the chat so that you can read them because it would take a long time to read them all. We're so fortunate to have four eminent speakers, people who come from very different spheres, but they are all absolutely committed to peace and to the avoidance of war. Our first speaker is Dr. Allison Benowski, and her topic is, Can Australia Avoid Another War? Thank you, Allison.
Thank you very much, Margaret, and thank you too, Therese, and everyone in Raising Peace for your terrific efforts over recent times, and you're really making an impact when our kind of discussion is so rarely heard in the mainstream media. So it's really important what you're doing and continuing to do, and I thank you for it. So we have to consider, can Australia avoid another war? Now, my working life was as a diplomat, and the diplomats get rolled in before the generals. And if the diplomats fail, the generals come in, and then there's a war. My argument is, forget the war and have the diplomacy, because in the end, after the war, you have to have a conference. So let's just skip the war and have the conference, is my simplistic view as an ex-diplomat. Unfortunately, this is not the way it currently works. After World War I, those of us old enough to remember, and certainly after World War II and after Vietnam, it would not have been conceivable, I think, to any of us that we would be contemplating another war. We were so over our wars, so were our parents, so were our grandparents, that we actually thought it was inconceivable that we would go to war anymore. People in Europe had the same view. They said, forming the European Union gradually, step by step. The reason for doing it was because fighting war to resolve their individual national differences was primitive. And they would do something more rational and spare themselves the terrible disasters and sacrifices that they had seen throughout the 20th century and before. And the European Union were absolutely right about that. The only problem was they got themselves involved in NATO. And NATO is a defense organization which obliges each of them to defend the other with military means. Furthermore, we all of us, signed up to the UN Charter, and the UN Charter said that we will not resort to force against other nations unless we are directly attacked or unless the UN Security Council obliges us to do something about that. All of us, modern democracies, signed up to that. We have signed numerous treaties since then saying the same thing, including the ASEAN Treaty of Peace and Amity, which echoes the UN Charter and says we will not use or threaten force against any of the members of the treaty, or indeed against anybody else. And yet, that is exactly what we are now doing. Why are we now doing this? And who is doing it? Let's face it. The only countries, apart, if you spare the current situation between Russia and Ukraine, the only countries in the world who threaten others with military force to achieve their own objectives are the United States and its allies, which includes us. So we are actually breaching the very undertakings in international law that we have signed up to, and which we keep referring to, or the US does, and some people in Australia do, as the international rules-based order. I am so over the international rules-based order, which we've been hearing about since 2017. And the whole point about that is it's a US created order that suits the United States imperial empire around the world, which is an empire of business undergirded by military means. We subscribe to that instead of to the actual rules-based order, the international rules-based order, to which we and others, everyone else, almost everyone else, signed up with the UN Charter in 1945. Nothing has changed. They are right to say that this is what we are obliged to sustain. And forcing our views on other countries by military means has always been a disaster, but particularly for Australia. Ever since 1945, we have not fought a war with our American allies in which we have been successful, not one. If you were running a business and you did that kind of thing for 60 years, your shareholders would say, hey, why do you go on repeating this costly, unproductive exercise? And yet we, the shareholders, that's us, the Australian people, are not saying to our government, hey, why are you continuing to do this? Why do you keep repeating the same exercise again and again? You know, the definition of insanity is to go on doing what you did before and keep expecting a different result. The different result is not going to happen if we let us stay out of Ukraine, for God's sake. But if we were to find ourselves because of our alliance with the United States, at war with China, it's a war we would lose. They would lose, we would lose it by ourselves, and we would also lose it by proxy, because we would be an enemy of China, and a very easily sacrificed enemy, which could be attacked by China, and the United States could sit back and see it happen. Why we go on with this obviously insane behavior is beyond me. The only explanation I have for it at the moment is that in Australia, over the last 10 plus years, we have degraded diplomacy, we have diminished the Foreign Service, we have nationalized security in every possible part of our government, academia, and media, to the point where nobody can say anything in Canberra that opposes the sorts of views that I've just expressed. If I said this stuff in Canberra, there are people who would just shut down and not listen. Maybe it's because I am too old, but I do remember. And the current generation doesn't remember what happened. The current generation, I'm afraid, has known nothing but what I've just been talking about. And they are so afraid not to go along with it that we are stuck with it. And so that's why I particularly welcome what Raising Peace is doing, what all the other organizations, the Anti-AUKUS Alliance, my own organization, Australians for War Powers Reform, is doing. And I'll just end up with a very quick promo for that. One of the things that our little organization is trying to do is legislatively change the way Australian governments go to war, which is in effect a decision by the Prime Minister of the day or a very small group around him, all appointed by him or her. And all they have to do is say, the troops go, and they go. Now, in most modern democracies, that is not the case. Fortunately, as the ambassador will tell you, in Chile, they don't even have armed forces to do that, which is a lovely consummation, devoutly to be wished. But in Australia, that is what happens. And what we are trying to do, many would like to outlaw all war, but what we're trying to do is step by step say, the government of Australia cannot do this without consulting the elected members of the Parliament in both the lower house and the Senate, and oblige them to have a debate and vote before Australian troops are committed to war anywhere, anytime. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alison. That's a stirring call to action for us to start tonight's debate. And Alison, you kept beautifully to time. Thank you. I'm giving each speaker about 10 to 15 minutes, and that is so that we have plenty of time for questions and comment and discussion at the end of each presentation. It now gives me very much pleasure to invite Reverend Dr. Thorwald Lorenzo to speak. Thank you for being with us tonight. And his topic is Peace Must Be Waged. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I hope you can hear me okay. Let me start with a personal comment. When I was a child, I experienced war at first hand. I can still hear the sirens warning us of approaching bombers and compelling us to seek shelter. I can still see the sky filled with bombers and bombs raining down upon us like sparkling stars and exploding right around us. I lost 2 grandfathers in the war, one in the firebombing of Hamburg, and the other one because of a heartbreak, because he could not defend his family. A baby brother died of lack of food, and my mother was taken away by Russian soldiers. My immediate family was uprooted for years to come. The other source of my being part of the peace movement is my Christian faith. Since many wars have been started by so-called Christian nations and Christian leaders, let me say that for me, the waging of peace is part of my Christian identity. I affirm the basic melody of the Hebrew and Christian scriptures that nations shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks, and that they shall learn war no more. Jesus of Nazareth was vehement, but he was non-violent. During his life on earth, he declared peacemakers to be the children of God. And Christianity began when, in the power of the Spirit, Jesus Christ spoke peace into the lives of the disciples. So far, my personal comment. I would like to make a proposal. It has to do with my conviction that we need a paradigm shift from a culture where war is seen as a possibility, where war is seen as an effective response to human conflict, to a culture of peace. As a step towards a culture of peace, I would like to make the modest proposal that we make a conscious and conscientious decision, a presumption, to agree to a presumption for peace and against war. Such a presumption would avoid 2 extremes. On the one hand, it would avoid the extreme of an ideological pacifism. Given human greed, nationalism, and aggression, some wars may be unavoidable. If an aggressor attacks you, like in a school or in a shopping center, he or she needs to be stopped. Perhaps World War II, perhaps the Kosovo War, perhaps the war in the Ukraine fall into that category. But most wars are not necessary. In recent years, I have been part of the opposition to the wars in Vietnam, Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. On the other hand, a presumption for peace and against war, while not denying human conflict, but it denies that war is the adequate response to human conflict. Traditional theories, like war being the continuation of policy with other means, or if you want peace, you prepare for war, or even the just war theory no longer work in a nuclear age. I therefore suggest that a presumption for peace and against war should be the default position in our personal conscience and in our national culture. If there is a departure from such a presumption, then the burden of proof should be on the departure, and it can only be done by a legitimate and a legitimized authority, not the prime minister or the president, but as we have just heard, only the parliament as the legitimate representative of the people can overturn such a presumption. Thirdly, I would like to ask the question whether such a presumption for peace and against war is grounded or can be grounded in reality. This is an important question for me. A presumption for peace and against war will work if people can feel that somehow it is anchored in reality, in the nature of things. Governments can enhance peace, but they cannot command it. People need to feel that peace is possible because it is grounded in reality. What then is the center of reality? You see, some people say that the center of reality is conflict. Then war seems to be inevitable. It would be part of the human condition. But if the center of reality is determined by love and peace, then war can be seen as a distortion of reality. And we can joyously and enthusiastically lean into the spirit of life and employ our courage and imagination to oppose war and create peace. But as Immanuel Kant said over 200 years ago, peace does not come natural. It needs to be waged. Peace is waged when we commit ourselves to a culture of peace. To create a culture of peace, we need personal and structural elements. Personally, each one of us is invited to develop a spirituality of peace. You don't need to be religious for developing a spirituality of peace. But the presumption for peace and against war needs to sit deeply in your conscience. It must belong to your personal identity. It must be our ultimate concern. It must occupy a place in our conscience. On the structural level, our governments would help to create a culture of peace if they develop a structure and imagination of defense rather than participating in any striving for global dominance. The war in the Ukraine teaches us that countries have the right and duty to protect themselves, but they do not have the right to become an aggressor. We need to encourage peace studies in our schools and universities. Governments need to develop a peace corps which have at the center of their concern the creation of peace in the region. And we need to respectfully intensify our relationship with neighbors in Asia and the Pacific, and refuse to take sides in any global struggle for dominance. I conclude. The Charter of the United Nations begins with the words, "We, the people of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, and to affirm faith in fundamental human rights." The same emphasis can be found in the Hebrew Bible, where peace and justice will kiss each other. As we work to create a culture of peace by adopting a presumption for peace and against war, we do our bit to make a humane survival on this one earth we have possible. And remember, peace must be waged by every one of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Lorenzo. That again is a wonderful call to action for all of us, and we do appreciate your very thoughtful contribution. I know some of you are probably wanting to get involved in the debate, but we will continue with our two other speakers, and then we'll have plenty of time for your questions and comments. It now gives me much pleasure to introduce Helen Rose, who is going to speak to us about art and using art as power in our advocacy and determination to wage peace. Thanks very much, Helen.
Well, Reverend Lorenzo, peace must be waged. I couldn't agree more. And myself and the Sydney Peace Prize winner, my partner, George Gittos, we declared education and art on Afghanistan in 2010. When we set up the Yellow House Jalalabad, we were invited by, at first we were working in the tribal belt of Pakistan on the border, and we're invited by a group of actors to come to Jalalabad and help them start, establish and strengthen their filmmaking industry there. And that's when I had the pleasure of being one of the first European woman to appear in a Pashtun film. So our Yellow House Jalalabad came about slowly. It evolved because we were staying in a hotel, and we thought, no, we really need a space. And both George had the Yellow House in King's Cross, and I was in the 80s in a place called the Gunnery in Woolloomooloo Bay in Sydney. And we thought we want to establish a community arts centre in Jalalabad. And so that evolved into the Yellow House, Jalalabad. And we did declare education, we declared art, we declared music on Jalalabad, and it instantaneously appealed and spread like wildfire among the young community of poets, musicians, actors, painters, all of them, and created this beautiful place in the heart of Jalalabad. We have very exciting breaking news, actually, and that is that George returned to Jalalabad just in the last month, and has been consulting and working with the new Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan government and the high officials in that government, and they have invited us back to Jalalabad and saying that anyone who is a friend of Afghanistan, we do not forget. And so that's an extraordinary achievement. Now, we had a battle for that, in fact, and because at first our normal process of gaining a visa to Afghanistan is through the embassy in Canberra, and they kept faffing around, and suddenly we were told that they had technical issues and they couldn't issue us a visa, and they advised us to get a visa through the new Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan embassy in Islamabad. And so I contacted the embassy in Islamabad, and I spoke to the new regime, the Taliban, the T word. And my goodness, he was a human being, and he was very well spoken, spoke perfect English and incredibly polite, and told us that we needed to get a letter of non-objection from the Australian embassy in Islamabad, or from our Australian embassy here in Australia. So we were denied that by Penny Wong's office, and we consider that, we thought that was a foolish move. In several reasons. Number one is because George is a famous artist and filmmaker, but we are the oldest independent documentary film company in Australia. George started making films in the 70s. So it was thwarting this wonderful bridge that we had built over the years. But how marvelous that George decided in his maverick manner that he was just going to go to Islamabad, go into the embassy, meet with the officials there, who said those wonderful words to George, that they knew of our work, because we worked there with the children, with women. I ran the Yellow House Jalalabad women's workshops, and that they do not forget their friends. So we now have multi-entry visa into Afghanistan, and also we've been given permission to make a documentary, and that's quite unprecedented. I think we're the first people, Europeans, non-Afghans, to do that. So the exciting thing is, I'll jump quickly to what it's like to reintroduce the arts to a culture that has virtually sort of been ground zero to culture. I mean, the musicians were the most conspicuous people when we first arrived in Afghanistan. They were roaming around. They were allowed to play at weddings. So we would hear huge, loud bands that would go for several days, because weddings last for several days. They're a bit like in Europe. And so the musicians and the actors, everyone started to come to the Yellow House. And I couldn't speak Pashto at first, so I started to learn the language through learning the songs of the region. And the musicians loved the fact that I was there and a singer, and not a politician, not an normal NGO, not the press wearing their helmets and their flak jackets. We go completely unprotected, except by our wits and our art. And so I started to, and they wanted me to sing jazz songs. So I sang jazz songs, and they knew the jazz songs and they adored that. And so then I started to learn Pashto by learning their songs. And on International Women's Day in 2017, I was the first woman, not just the European woman, but the first woman to sing to a mixed audience of men and women in 80 years. And I sang a song called Larsha Ningaha, which is the song of the region, and I sang it in Pashto and I sang it in English. And that was received so, people were amazed. At the end of the performance, that you could have heard a pin dropped, and I was sort of semi-filled with dread. But then there was just this burst of applause, and it was just, people were so, they felt honored that I'd learned Pashto, the language. They felt honored that I'd learned the song of their region, and they felt, you know, that I'd translated it into English as well, was marvelous. And then when our film Snow Monkey was released, the film that we made in that year, in 2017, about the street children of Jalalabad, I sang that song at every film opening around the world. So people for the first time in Europe experienced hearing not an ethnic sound, but realizing that the words that of those songs are foreign, and they sound strange, they sound melodic and beautiful, had the similar meaning to our own songs. So the arts has an enormous power, not only in that sense, but in so many varieties, to build bridges. So, for example, the Yellow House is funded entirely from the sale of George's artwork. So we have no government funding, we have no NGO or anything like that. So it's basically arts funded. So with the Yellow House Jalalabad women's team, they first came in wearing their burqas, because it's mandatory to wear burqas, although things have changed a bit now. And so it was a gradual process of building trust, and their ability to learn was, they were voracious learners, and we taught editing, we taught everything that goes behind the camera, because women aren't allowed to be filmed. Until we discovered that the word niqab, of course, means mask. And so on a trip to Norway, we were working with a Norwegian company called Perea. I grabbed a whole lot of masks, so some, you know, very pretty ones, and George grabbed a whole lot of sort of boyish, ugly, you know, monstery ones for the boys. And I bought them back and I put them out on display, and the women went straight for the monster masks and called their teams the Scorpions or the Lionesses. So, you know, the arts is you know, I don't need to give everybody a psychological lesson on the power of the arts to, you know, to empower people, to build confidence, to help human beings connect their cerebral, you know, mental brain power to their bodies, and create a creative mindset for any kind of job. So we say, in a world that, you know, where we hear it, you know, we had COVID, we've got this terrible war, invasion of Ukraine by the Russians. There's sayings like expect the unexpected or expect the unthinkable. And these words kind of send a chill through us, but we say those phrases can be turned around. So who would have thought that George could go into Afghanistan, meet the heads of the Taliban, be given permission to now we're buying a Yellow House in Jalalabad, and all our community of artists that are there are coming around us, and we're creating this marvelous bridge again. Many of our people from Afghanistan have come to Australia and performed here. They've come to the Sydney Film Festival or the Melbourne International Film Festival, and they're loved by the Australian public. The films have been shown on SBS and ABC, and we get emails all the time from average Australians concerned about the people, just the regular people that we that feature in our films in Afghanistan. So I'm going to jump now to we've just spent 4 months in Ukraine, and again, people were astounded that we did that in Australia. They were astounded by that. They were astounded around the world, but particularly the Ukrainians, who were thrilled. And as we know, this war, this invasion of Russia, it really is a kind of battle of truth and lies. And so as soon as we go to these places, we automatically connect with the artists. Now we have a new philosophy where we realize that artists are a global network, and we have a virtual country, and we have a virtual language. So in Afghanistan, when we arrived there, the poets, the musicians, everyone knew about Rumi, everyone knew about Jalaluddin, you know, people you knew about, you know, so and in Ukraine, you know, we speak the same language. They knew who Rumi was. They knew who Jalaluddin was. They knew who Kandinsky is. So we speak this same language. And artists, of course, are discriminated against because we look strange or we're creative, we've got a big hair or something, but also because we speak truth. And we speak truth through the language of symbols, through sound, and that is a threat to autocracies, and we know that. And with the stabbing of Salman Rushdie recently in New York, the whole new wave of cancel culture, which is a real attack on our Western culture, cultural freedoms of expression, and so when we join together, we're a force. So when we arrived in Ukraine and decided that we were going to go ahead and have an art show in the bombed house of Irpin, just outside of Kyiv, we joined up with several artists, and it was just very empowering for the artists. It kept their message, their anti-war message flowing. It gave them strength that we were there to stand with them. And it had a ricocheting effect, like dropping a pebble in the water. So when we arrived at the actual destroyed House of Art in Irpin, where you'd see an entire grand piano sort of reduced to a pile of ash, and rows of seats, and goodness knows what precious antiquities destroyed. Gradually, the neighbors that had started coming back to Kyiv joined us and were helping us hang things on the walls. They, you know, they came every day to help us, bringing ladders or anything that we needed to bring back the soul, to bring back the culture, because so many artists are saying that this is an attempt to destroy Ukrainian culture yet again by Russia. And artists are the keepers of culture, just as the religious leaders are, they're the keepers of the sacred soul. You know, we work together in this beautiful way that really can aim invisible golden arrows at those like Putin, who are seeking with their henchmen and women to drag us all into the pits of hell. Because I know, Reverend, you were talking about witnessing the bombing of in Germany. And while we were in Kyiv, of course, the sound of bombing kept getting closer and closer as the battle waged between the Ukrainian forces to push the Russians out of Bucha, Irpin, and Borodianka. And there is something I think that this is very important that we need to talk about. I'm probably going over time, but is that we need to really look at how we choose our politicians. How, who are they, and how, we really need to, when someone like Donald Trump can rise to power in America, it seemed to be like a domino effect of this sort of virus, this spiritual, cultural virus spreading. And I think that we need to, with our brilliant minds, start thinking of ways to countermand that, to bring new protocols to, how who can run for Parliament, those sorts of things. And the other thing I think we need to be very, very well aware of, and I'm sure everyone is, and that is the right not to be manipulated. And I know that the middle classes are always targeted, because I get comments from people saying, oh, but what about the women? And how could you wear a burqa as a feminist? And I say, well, I could wear a burqa because I can take it off. And I think that if I can go and sacrifice some of my time to the betterment, to empowering the women of Jalalabad in that way, if we can all think outside the box, then, as everyone is saying, then we have a hope that we can change our reality, that we can feel as though this reality is anchored of peace.
Thank you very much, Helen. That was a very important and different contribution for us to consider in our discussions at the end. I'd now like to invite our final speaker, the Costa Rica ambassador, Victor Vargas. He gave me a lesson in pronunciation, but I'm not sure that I passed it. And he is going to talk to us about building new global alliances for peace. And I can't think of anybody better to talk to us on this subject, because Costa Rica has not had a military force in that country since December 1948. And I'm sure, sadly, many people may not know that, and we need to broadcast that message far and wide. Has not had a military presence or department since December 1948. Congratulations, Ambassador. That's a wonderful record, and we're looking forward to hearing from you. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you very much for you and for all the previous speakers, and for the initiative of Raising Peace. I would like to share with you 3 ideas or 3 aspects on the experience of Costa Rica as a nation that abolished the armed forces 74 years ago and adopted neutrality 39 years ago. We've learned that peace sustains itself on a continuous construction in the most diverse fields: education and culture, foreign policy, and the courts of justice, to cite 3 current examples. The act of abolition of militarism on December 1st, 1948, consisted in the delivery of the keys to the main headquarters of the capital city by the Ministry of Security to the Ministry of Education to transform the military fortress into the National Museum. And in front of the imposing citadel on the top of a hill, Democracy Square was later built, where the Abolition Day is celebrated annually. In each primary school in the country, this hymn is sung. My translation, I am sure, is not poetic, but maybe it conveys a little bit of the spirit that the children of Costa Rica are singing every year now. The 1st of December in our motherland, the history of the country was transformed. The sharp-nailed silence forever, the thunder of the rifle and the cannon. That is why today the world knows us and respects us for that decision of lifting notebooks and violins instead of a cruel and destructive rifle. Costa Rica, without weapons, has the strength of a large battalion. Let us sing with pride, long live peace and death to the cannon. And of course, in singing this hymn, children have to discuss among themselves and with their teachers what is behind it and what is the culture of peace that comes with it. An 8-year-old law declares that peace is a fundamental human right for all inhabitants in a republic. Likewise, it prohibits the installation in national territory of any industry for the manufacture of weapons of war. In addition, it imposes on the state the obligation to include curricular content on peace in preschool, primary, and secondary education programs, to encourage peace studies in educational centers, and contribute to the establishment of a culture of peace in Costa Rican society. Now, this is a permanent challenge, easier to say than to do it. What constitutes a real culture of peace, and how it applies personally, in the family, in the community, and the nation? On December the 1st of this year, a colloquium will take place in Canberra on the abolition of militarism in Costa Rica. Academics from Australia and Costa Ricans residing here in Australia will present different perspectives on this unique democratic and peaceful trajectory. And if anyone is interested, please get in touch with the Embassy of Costa Rica in Canberra. My second observation has to do with the fact that a compact democracy located between continents and oceans, Costa Rica cannot and does not aspire to remove or replace a king in any national jurisdiction. I don't know if the expression exists in English. Ni quita ni pone rey. Does not have the power to remove or replace a king anywhere. But with moral authority, our country speaks for the cause of humanity in matters of war and peace. That is how 3 months ago, the President of the Republic, Rodrigo Chávez, spoke by telephone with President Volodymyr Zelensky, to whom he expressed Costa Rica's support for Ukraine in the face of the military aggression that is bleeding that European people. This was defined as support for Ukraine's request to join the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, as well as for the creation of a special court with the capacity to judge war crimes. The freedom of all the peoples of the world is the freedom of Costa Rica and the entire world, said Chávez, who describes Zelensky as the leader of a people who defends themselves with their nails against the military attack. A sympathetic citizen of the aggressor party filed an action before the Constitutional Court demanding a reprimand from the judicial power to the executive power under the premise that the principle of neutrality of Costa Rica had been violated. Last Friday, that is 5 days ago, the magistrates concluded that support for the European country is limited within the framework of the international law mechanisms that Ukraine chose to address the conflict. That is to say, it is not about supporting the armed operation, but about the actions that Ukraine seeks from international law as a means of settling disputes, the Constitutional Court said. The High Judges concluded that the actions of the Presidency of the Republic were in accordance with the pacifist tradition established in the constitutional order. This is to say that the question of Costa Rica expressing a viewpoint about a military conflict in another area of the world is discussed by citizens everywhere as they discuss the results of the soccer games, or as they discuss other problems that of the many problems that Costa Rica faces. The consequences of that war for Costa Rica are already being felt in energy prices, in basic food prices, in world inflation, said the president. However, we also feel consequences in our hearts because an armed invasion of a neighboring and peaceful country by a world power is unjustifiable. And the Ministry of Foreign Affairs had this to say: Costa Rica recognizes that the current military aggression against Ukraine constitute a violation of effective multilateralism, international law, and the Charter of the United Nations Organization, and continues to urge the parties to resume dialogue with a view to finding a peaceful solution to the conflict. Faithful to its tradition of neutrality, Costa Rica will continue to support the defense of freedom and human rights, as well as the defense of Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity, with a firm conviction that the solution to any type of external threat can be found in international law and in the multilateral system of collective security. And now my third observation and final. Peace, like a respectable matron, a lady of respectful age, suffers from cruelty of the press. On the other hand, work, like an attractive Venus or Adonis, enjoys the favor of the press. Certainly, this reflects the weight of history that prefers to speak not of periods of peace in human history, but periods between wars, of the interest of the military-industrial complex, and of the morbid nationalism embraced by warmongering regimes. It is the rule of hatred and force over brotherhood and understanding. In other words, the ultimate irrationality, since the abusive use of force is the failure of the rationality of diplomacy and politics. Are the prospects for world peace, effective democracy, sustainable development, ecological balance, respect for diversity, or the well-being of people better than last February, or worse, this September of 2022? The answer is obvious. Warmongering spreads like wildfire, while pacifism seems to be on the ropes. Last April, Costa Rica invited in New York the representative of 22 member states of the United Nations that do not have standing armed forces, with the purpose of considering the possibility of becoming a group that speaks with one voice in favor of uplifting peace and against rampant warmongering. The consultations continue. And who knows, as Helen just said, a simple pebble can stir up a large lake. The democracy of the 21st century is increasingly the articulation of powerful social movements. Perhaps we are still in time to build a new global alliance for peace, which unites so many scattered forces in a single bundle of wheels. Those who fight from the civil society against climate change mark the way forward. Parliamentary leaders, political parties, institutional mechanisms of democracy will have robust support to promote urgent actions of dialogue, understanding, and peace that lessen the threat of major conflagrations. This could be a call to action to amalgamate millions of people in the struggle for peace for the world today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, this has been a very inspiring hour of very thoughtful presentations, and it's now the opportunity for you to ask questions. Try to make them as precise and direct as you can. And Charlie, I'm going to ask you to help facilitate how people are called. And please, if you're not called, leave yourselves muted. And of course, if you are called, do make sure that you unmute. Charlie, over to you.
Awesome. So if anyone would like to ask a question, you can use the raise hand function, which should be at the bottom of your screen. It should say there should be a few options, and one of them will be a raised hand function. And if not, you can put a question in the chat. Awesome.
I think I can see I can see one now. It's, is it Rita?
Yeah, Rita.
Rita, over to you. Thank you.
I would just like to ask the ambassador if he would say again about this conference that's happening in Canberra. It sounded very interesting, and perhaps we could he could put something in the chat or just tell us about it again.
Ambassador.
Next year is going to be 75 years since the abolition of the army in Costa Rica. So we decided to invite a number of scholars who are following Costa Rica from here or doing research on our peace policies and contributions or efforts, excerpts to come together for a presential and virtual colloquium on the 1st of December here in Canberra. We still have to announce the exact place for them to present a series of papers that they will prepare, papers that will be discussed among some 30 participants, 25 to 30 participants, and later these papers will be edited, rewritten, expanded, etc., until finally we could have a manuscript that maybe could be printed as a book for next year. And this way, a group of scholars from Australia could reflect on the trajectory of Costa Rica in this respect from different angles. And this would maybe leave at least a text and a text online that could be consulted by those interested in this type of activity.
Thank you. The next person is Greg from New Zealand.
Thank you. Yes, I would ask what the relevance of two concepts. One is looking at the general population and why they feel supported, so supportive of the military. And I suggest it's around about how we deal with our security and how we deal with supposed threats of whatever source from outside. And I suggest that deep in our DNA, it's very, very firmly entrenched belief that the obvious solution to our threat is the military power. I don't think most of the military wants war. I don't think most people want war. But it's this connection, and comes deep from our history and from our literature, our media, all sorts of things reinforce this link between security and military power. Now, if we manage to change that link so that people saw that link, the response to threat is through our diplomacy and our cooperation with other nations. And I must say that our Prime Minister has just said that, was prepared that for her talk at the UN. And so it's not a logical thing. People's behaviors are not necessarily logical, and I think it's just the natural sense that only military can do things and diplomacy can't. Now, how to get credibility behind this idea of diplomacy solving problems, you need a common process of quality of good relationships. Now, New Zealand and Australia have good relationships. We're very different countries, actually, but we do have good relationships, and we don't think of defending ourselves against each other.
Can I ask you? Can I suggest that perhaps the panel comment on your thoughts to date?
Okay.
Allison, I will start with you. Yes. Allison?
Thank you, Gray, and thank you, Margaret. It's an important question that Gray raises, why we have to respond in a military way when we have differences between us with other countries. And what I was trying to argue before was that it is the least effective way of dealing with those differences, because it actually tends to perpetuate them. But you know, in Australia, we have an interesting history of dealing with problems that have confronted us. And the most successful of those have been when we didn't use military means at all. I said before that we've lost all these wars ever since 1945. And so what's the point of fighting more of them? But what we also did during that period, whenever our allies were not involved, we did successful things. In the case of Bougainville, together with New Zealand, we managed to resolve a situation there. We did the same in East Timor. We did the same in Cambodia. We did the same in the Solomon Islands. And in all of those situations, Australia used diplomatic means and civil society means, not military force. And without resorting to military force, we didn't leave behind a whole lot of hostility. We're not claiming that the problems that we managed to resolve at that time have not re-emerged or will not re-emerge in the future. But that is the Australian experience. And that is why it's deplorable that our diplomatic service has been so degraded and so wound down and so subjected to the primacy of national security talk in this country. And I'm hoping that under this government, we will see that reversed. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Lorenzo, would you like to comment?
I think the need for security is perfectly legitimate, but don't underestimate the other ways for nations to fight wars. There is a strong tendency for the industrial military complex. There is also the need people in larger nations feel to extend their areas of influence. I think if we critically examine our own government's policy, we will find that there is more than just being committed to defense. If you look at some of the aspects of the recent AUKUS arrangements, I think there are more elements than just defense. And therefore, I would suggest that the need for security is legitimate. But the possibility of industrial military complex and the extension of influence is not legitimate.
Helen, and would you like to comment?
I can, yes, I have a comment, and I think there is a solution to these, to that kind of intrinsic desire to have wars, and that is through the arts. I think that we need more, as was said before, that civil society actions. We need, we need to, when you think of the trillions of dollars that were squandered in bombing Afghanistan, yet one little yellow house, our one little yellow house, that didn't receive even $1 million, and it costed the Australian government $1 million for each soldier a year to participate in that carnage. We need to think, war is primitive. War is an archaic mode of behavior. We need to address that sort of aggression and come across, and deeply in our schools. And we need to start thinking beyond that. So I had a situation where I had my first Rose Theatre at the Yellow House, Jalalabad, and I was doing children's theatre sports workshops. Now, some of the fathers came in who were ex-Mujahideen to see the workshop. And in the end, I had the Mujahideen fathers doing theatre sports. So, and we had the protection of the Taliban in Jalalabad while we were there, just as we do now. And the sons of one of the big guys, Haqqani, was bought. He had 7 sons, and several of them decided they wanted to stay and learn how to use cameras, because we must supply depredated cultures with other possibilities. If we went and declared education on Afghanistan back when the Russians, we had an opportunity then, what an extraordinary world we would have then if we could start to incorporate more civilians, because I know that, even going from Ukraine to south side of Chicago, nobody wants to participate in war. And it seems to be that there are smaller groups that somehow manipulate the larger vulnerable groups and whip them up into creating a hell on earth, to regressing the world. Now, I'll just say one last thing that George would say, and he believes, perhaps incredibly optimistically, but that perhaps this war, this invasion of Ukraine, I want to specify that, it could be the end of all wars. Why? Because it's hit everybody in the wallet, and including China. So China is now, we're starting to see cracks in Putin's facade, including China realizing that there are a lot more repercussions with sanctions, etc. So I think we need to start, and I commend that type of new way of thinking. Instead of using our brilliant minds to create nuclear bombs, let's use our brilliant minds to create peace, to figure it out.
Thank you. I can see three further questioners, so I'm going to go to them now as I'm watching the time. The first is Ben, then Frank, and then Daniel. Thank you.
I think Daniel raised their hand first.
Oh, did he? Oh, sorry. Sorry, Daniel. Will you go first?
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you. So my name is Daniel Gabina, and I work at a refugee migrant resettlement center here in Blacktown in Sydney. Well, I'm originally from Ethiopia, so one of the biggest wars that's happening currently in the world that doesn't get much cover. And my question to the panelists is, why do you think, I mean, Helen kind of touched on it, I guess. One of the things that the Ukraine war is a bit more popular because it's hitting people in the pocket. Is there anything more to it that gets the Ukraine war a bit more awareness in the media? While there's a huge war, which some people say that more than 500,000 people potentially have died in the just the current war in Ethiopia. Any reason why the Ethiopia war is not getting much cover? That's one thing. The second thing is, how can we bring those to the Ukraine war or peace movement or the peace campaign and the Ethiopian peace campaign? How do we bring it together so that there is that solidarity? Is there a way? Could we be creative in forming that awareness as well?
Thank you.
Yeah, so for me, currently, I heard about this meeting from a friend, Shoshana. I think she's here in the meeting, and she informed me, because I was talking to her, that it would be great if we can have a meeting. So if anyone is interested, we're planning for just a brainstorming meeting on Friday at 10 a.m. on Zoom. Please send me your email or things like that. I'm happy if Raising Peace is happy also to share that link. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Ambassador, would you like to be the first to comment?
I will gladly do so, but I was thinking, why don't we hear 2 or 3 more questions, and then maybe there will be some common threads. What do you think, Senator?
I think that sounds a very good suggestion. Ben first, and then Frank.
Well, thank you. Yes, very, very interesting discussion. And I'm a social ecologist, and I did my research on anti-racism through drama education as part of my doctorate. And the thing for me is that I was teaching adult migrant English, and I found people, as they came to Australia, would start learning English and start forgetting that they came from countries that were at war or in conflict. So the thing is, I think what the ambassador of Costa Rica was drawing attention to, and what Helen's drawing attention to, was the arts, because the arts and education changed the whole mindset of people. And in Australia, we started on the invasion of Indigenous people by people who were being sent out because they couldn't fill, they had so many jails in the UK. And no wonder we have this conflict mindset. We have this fear because we've grown out of invasion. But what if we could turn that around, begin to negotiate with the Indigenous people, create some sort of treaty with them, and come to some agreement that we could live peacefully together? Maybe we could go in the direction of Costa Rica and have education and art replace the military. So that's my proposal.
Wonderful suggestion. Thank you. Frank, your comment now, or question.
Thank you. Ambassador, if I understood you correctly, Costa Rica wants to support Ukraine, not with weapons, but with some sort of program of mediation, and I was wondering with what proposals that Costa Rica had in mind, or they're waiting to develop them, like in your meetings that are coming up in Australia. So, yeah, that's the question.
Ambassador?
Thank you very much. Very interesting questions, of course. I think that to put it very briefly, if the conflict in Ethiopia were in the middle of Europe, everyone around the world will know all details about it, or certain details from one side and others from other parts. But the war against Ukraine is in the middle of Europe, and that's the reason why, of course, one superpower is involved and a group of nations are reacting, etc. But there is no question that some countries, some cities are stages, world stages for a number of things. You can do something very interesting in a little city and nothing will happen. You go to New York City and everyone will do it immediately around the world. And the media are mostly Western dominated. There is a lot of research and literature in that respect. Frank, Costa Rica is a small country, and we do not pretend to get among the horses to be overcome. No, we are supporting, the government is supporting some initiatives that have been adopted by Ukraine within the framework of international law and the institutions created by international law to try to find a solution to their problems. Costa Rica will not get involved, of course, in mediating between different countries far away from Costa Rica. That will be very difficult, well above the possibilities that democracy of 5 million people in the middle of the Americas will have. And Ben is right. Education, art will open up the minds of new generations into peace. But we need to think and act to bring together all these forces that are speaking up for peace, but we need to create a big movement. I remember a few years ago when a very famous band from, or a number of singers came together to do a number of concerts around the world for the environment. And I wonder if we could think in terms like that to do something to call the attention for the urgency of peace in today's conflicts that are threatening the existence of humanity. And what other initiatives can we take? We respect very much civil society in Australia because the peace movement here has been very successful in many respects and well recognized by the Nobel Peace Prize a few years ago. And I think that some of that spirit should be shared with other countries and make this a true international movement coming from the south to the north and spreading the urgency of peace and not just talk among ourselves about it.
Allison and Dr. Lorenzo, would you like to make a comment on those questions? And then we'll probably have to wind up, I think. Allison?
Thank you, Margaret, and thank you, Your Excellency. It was a really enlightening proposal of yours, and I hope that people take it up, remember it, promote it, and do some things that we have thought in the past were just beyond us. They aren't at all. And as soon as you start talking to people, thank goodness in a way for Zoom. Thank goodness for COVID that introduced us to Zoom, because we're now talking to people all over the world all the time. I can't get off the thing. And what you hear from other countries about what they're doing overbalances the negativity that we get constantly from our media, which really have to be disregarded because they've got a vested interest in the status quo. What we're looking at, all of us here, are looking at changing the status quo. Why do we have to go on doing what we've always done? Why do we have to go on having wars, which, as we've all agreed this evening, are primitive and pointless and do nothing but create harm and distress? Let's get away from all that. We are all together on this. And the kinds of initiatives that you have proposed, Ambassador, are very welcome. And I hope that Raising Peace is going to promote it. And thank you, everyone, for endorsing it.
Dr. Lorenzo.
It is really sad that we do not show the same attention on what's going on in Ethiopia and Yemen and Myanmar and Georgia. But we have to realize that the media determines our interest. And the media often, for instance, neglects what Helen Rose is doing. I have not heard about their activities in the Ukraine because I have not been able to see it in the media. So the media is really important, and that we need to win some of the prominent journalists into the peace movement. And do not forget that Ethiopia and Yemen and Myanmar, they are not part of this great conflict between what some people call democracy against autocracy. So they are outside the areas of influence. And therefore, we need to bring them up into the news, into the culture, in order to progress the peace movement.
Well, look, thank you very much indeed, everyone. I would love to see this session continue, but I have been told that we must finish up at 8:30, or I don't know if we all turn into pumpkins or what happens, but we must finish. So look, thank you all. The panel was just wonderful. Thank you for your contribution and your commitment to continue this debate and to continue ideas and advocacy, because that's what's needed. Every time we hear from the media, it's negative about the threats that face us. So we need to change that, and we need to work individually and collectively. And I know that Raising Peace and the organizations involved are going to continue to do that. And I look forward to working with you all, because I know Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, of course, has been, as the oldest women's peace movement, has been doing this for many, many, many years. And we must continue. It's vital for humanity. So thank you all. Thank you.